It's a really small, artificially lit room.
Yeah, with those terrible buzzing fluorescent bulbs overhead.
Exactly. And across this heavy wooden table from you sits a group of professionals.
Laptops open, faces totally neutral.
Right, completely unreadable. And these people, they basically hold the keys to your entire future.
They're making decisions about, your safety, your access to care.
Maybe even custody of your kids or your physical freedom, and you are just absolutely terrified.
The anxiety is just humming in your chest.
Like a live wire. Your breathing is shallow, your heart is literally hammering against your ribs, so you try to speak up.
Because you have to.
Right. You try to explain how their system has failed you, how the protocols just left you totally stranded. But instead of being heard, the professional sitting across from you just, they suddenly stiffen.
The energy completely changes.
It does. Their tone shifts from supportive to super defensive. And that collaborative energy in the room just evaporates in an instant.
The whole meeting shuts down into this rigid procedural checklist.
Yeah. And by the time you leave, you realize you've just been quietly labeled, difficult.
And the worst part is that label will follow you everywhere.
Oh, forever.
It gets embedded right into your file, and it alters every single subsequent interaction you ever have with that institution.
It's terrifying. And this breakdown happens every single day in statutory environments.
It really does. And to stop these rooms from turning into battlegrounds, we have to look at the invisible architecture of human panic.
Which is exactly what our mission is today. We are doing a deep dive into the mechanics of the Multidisciplinary Team meeting, or MDT.
We need to find out why these systems, which are literally built to care, so often trigger our absolute worst defense mechanisms.
So before we can fix what goes wrong across the meeting table, we really have to understand the deeply biological processes happening inside the minds of the people sitting at it.
Right. We have to look at the biology.
And one of the central sources in our stack today comes from Clive S. He's an independent researcher who maps out this cognitive threat escalation.
It's fascinating work.
It is. And he introduces this framework starting with what he calls baseline system instability.
Because we often look at an individual in a crisis and we assume, a single catastrophic event just pushed them over the edge.
Right, like one bad thing happened today. But the biological reality is much more insidious than that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The framework looks at allostatic load, which is basically the cumulative burden of chronic stress life events.
Cumulative being the key word there.
Right. So when we talk about systemic instability, we are talking about a nervous system that has been gradually eroded across multiple different domains.
Like sleep, right.
Yeah, chronic sleep disruption. It doesn't just make you tired. It severely impairs the prefrontal cortex.
Which is the logical part of the brain.
Exactly, the part responsible for executive function and emotional regulation. And then you add mounting financial pressure to that.
Which is so common.
And that creates this constant low-level infusion of cortisol straight into the bloodstream.
Just a steady drip of stress hormone.
Right. Then add unresolved past trauma, which literally leaves the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, in this state of mild hypertrophy.
Wait, hypertrophy? Like it physically changes?
Yes, it becomes physically enlarged and hyperreactive.
Yeah.
And if you add social isolation on top of that, it deprives the nervous system of oxytocin.
And we need oxytocin to naturally downregulate fear. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So by the time this person even walks into the meeting room, their biological baseline isn't anywhere near neutral.
They are already operating near the red line before anyone even says hello.
Exactly. And that accumulated physiological stress drastically lowers the threshold for what the brain perceives as danger.
Which brings us to a really cool concept from Clive S., the fire alarm theory of mind.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Right. Because we have to remember that the limbic threat circuitry in the human brain, it evolved for one primary purpose, which is survival.
It did not evolve for accuracy.
Exactly. Think about a fire alarm in a modern building. It's designed to activate rapidly and prioritize evacuation. It responds to the mere potential of danger.
It detects, particulate matter like smoke or a sudden change in heat.
But it doesn't pause to, confirm the existence of actual flames before triggering the sirens.
Because waiting for visual confirmation of a real fire would be fatal.
Right. So we tolerate false alarms in buildings, and the human brain basically operates on the exact same evolutionary heuristic.
It makes complete sense from a survival standpoint.
Yeah, like if our ancestors saw a rustle in the bushes, the ones who assumed it was a tiger and ran away, well, they survived.
Even if 9 times out of 10 it was literally just the wind.
Exactly. The one
Yeah.
guy who stayed to, verify the data, he got eaten.
Right.
So the brain is totally wired for false positives. Okay, let's unpack this. It's like having a hypersensitive smoke detector in your kitchen.
Yeah.
It goes off when you're just making toast, but your brain reacts by calling the fire department, smashing the windows, and evacuating the neighborhood.
The physiological response is incredibly logical if there's a massive fire.
But it's disastrous if it's just a bagel.
Exactly. And that disproportionate cascade is the core issue here.
So what exactly happens in the body when that internal alarm signals danger?
Well, within milliseconds, the autonomic nervous system just takes over. Heart rate spikes to pump oxygen to the major muscle groups.
So you can run.
Right. Digestion completely halts to conserve energy, and adrenaline just floods the bloodstream to prepare the body to either fight or flee.
But here's the really critical modern problem, right? What happens when that internal fire alarm goes off, but there is no external predator?
There's no tiger, there's no fire.
Right. There's no physical danger in the MDT room. But the conscious narrative-making part of the mind is suddenly flooded with all these biochemical signals of sheer terror.
And it demands an explanation. It looks at the environment and asks, why do I feel so profoundly unsafe right now?
And if the conscious mind can't find a tiger in the bushes, it basically just begins to invent one, doesn't it?
It has to. It has to map that internal terror onto something in the external world just to make sense of the physiological data it's receiving.
Which leads to what Clive S. calls a pattern surge.
Yes. So under this heightened state of autonomic threat activation, our natural human ability to recognize patterns just accelerates into an aggressive overdrive.
It's like the brain's search engine gets stuck on the highest setting.
Exactly. It's a highly volatile cognitive state. Thoughts accelerate, totally mundane details feel hyper-meaningful, and interpretations of reality just multiply at a terrifying speed.
The source material actually breaks this pattern surge down into a sequence of 5 distinct stages, and honestly, the mechanics of it are fascinating.
It really maps out the descent into crisis.
Yeah. So it starts with cognitive acceleration, just racing thoughts, a barrage of internal questions.
And then it moves into meaning amplification.
Right, where the brain is so desperate to locate the source of the danger, it starts assigning massive threat value to totally neutral stimuli.
Like, someone shifting in their chair across the table isn't just trying to get comfortable.
No, the brain says they're preparing to attack. Or, a clinician glancing at the clock isn't checking the time.
They're dismissively plotting to terminate your care.
Exactly. And as the brain assigns threat value to everything, the cognitive load becomes totally unsustainable.
Which initiates the third stage, which is derealization.
This part is wild, because the sheer volume of sensory and threat data just overwhelms the brain's processing capacity, right?
Yes. To protect itself from a complete systemic crash, the brain literally alters its perception of reality.
The person might begin to feel detached from their physical surroundings, like they are observing the meeting from outside their own body.
Or that the room itself has taken on this artificial, almost cinematic quality.
And at this point, the social decoding system entirely flips into hostile mode. Empathy recognition shuts down. Everyone in the room is mapped exclusively as a predator.
The source material actually includes a deeply personal account from Clive S. about this. He details an experience he had on a 12th floor balcony in Hong Kong.
Yeah, during a period of intense trauma. He describes this derealization so vividly, he felt entirely disconnected, like he was trapped between realities.
He says he actually contemplated throwing himself off the balcony.
But not out of suicidal intent, right?
No, and that's the crucial distinction. It was because his mind was so desperately trying to test the boundaries of reality.
He thought the extreme sensory input of falling might literally wake him up from the terrifying illusion.
He genuinely believed he might actually be lying unconscious in a hospital bed somewhere else entirely.
Oh, wow. That moment on the balcony just clearly illustrates the final stages of the pattern surge moral interpretation and escape ideation.
Right. Because when the external world becomes a hostile illusion, the mind turns inward to find an explanation for the terror.
Often pulling up past guilt, shame, or unresolved moral conflicts.
And eventually, the neurological pressure becomes so extreme that the brain just wants to terminate the sequence at any cost.
So, escape ideation, thoughts of running away or engaging in acute self-harm, You're saying this isn't primarily about a desire to die.
No, it is a highly functional, albeit dangerous attempt to interrupt an unbearable neurological loop.
It is a desperate mechanism to swap a feeling of endless, terrifying cognitive uncertainty for a feeling of concrete, intense sensory certainty.
Exactly. So when a clinician sees a patient engaging in self-harm, the traditional societal assumption is that it's attention-seeking.
Or manipulative.
Right. But looking at the neurobiology, self-harm in this context is actually an extreme regulation tool.
The trauma-informed case formulation paper we're analyzing goes into the precise functions of non-suicidal self-injury.
Yes. When the pattern surge peaks, the nervous system is locked in this sympathetic storm. The person requires an immediate state alteration.
And acute self-harm provides this massive overriding sensory input that forcibly interrupts the cognitive loop.
Because the physical pain triggers the release of endogenous opioids and endorphins.
The body's natural painkillers.
Yes, which paradoxically produce a profound sense of calm and grounding. It acts as an anti-dissociation mechanism.
The brain registers a sharp physical pain and concludes, okay, I can feel this localized damage, therefore my physical body exists, therefore I am grounded in reality.
It provides a moment of absolute localized control in a totally uncontrollable internal environment.
And this brings up a concept from the text that honestly reframes so much of everyday human behavior, the self-harm spectrum.
Because we typically only think of self-harm in terms of the fast, acute actions.
Right, like cutting. But the research argues there is an entire category of slow self-harm.
Behaviors driven by the exact same internal engine, the need to regulate distress and override internal warning signals, just operating on a longer timeline.
Fast self-harm is acute interruption. Slow self-harm is chronic override.
Exactly. And this includes a vast array of coping mechanisms. Binge eating, alcohol or drug misuse, compulsive gaming.
Overworking to the point of exhaustion, which is so normalized.
Chronic people-pleasing or even compulsive research and obsessive intellectual analysis.
Wait, obsessive research counts as slow self-harm.
Yes, because they all share the same maintaining neurobiological processes. They flood the brain with dopamine or cortisol to alter the current emotional state.
Which helps the individual avoid focusing on internal signals of profound grief or fear.
Right. They offer short-term psychological relief at a significant, cumulative, long-term physiological cost.
I think we all have a version of this. I mean, think about it. When your baseline is wobbling, when your allostatic load is peaking and you feel that vague humming sense of dread.
Right.
Maybe you don't end up on a balcony in Hong Kong, but maybe you sit on the couch and doom scroll through terrible news for 4 hours until your eyes blur and you feel numb.
Or maybe you throw yourself into a work spreadsheet at 11 p.m.
Yes. Just to manufacture a false sense of control over your environment, it's the exact same engine.
It is your brain trying to manually regulate its own misfiring fire alarm through external distraction.
Recognizing that shared human engine is so vital because it highlights what clinicians call the dynamic risk window.
Yes, this is so important for professionals to understand. There is a critical, measurable period between the early stages of cognitive acceleration and a full behavioral crisis.
During this window, the prefrontal cortex is still partially online. The individual is still reachable.
Their nervous system can still respond to external regulation like relational engagement, emotional validation, and calming vocal prosody.
So just speaking calmly can actually reach them.
Yes, in the window. But if that window closes, they cross what's called the escalation threshold.
And beyond that biological point, higher order thinking just shuts down completely.
Their behavior becomes entirely symbolic, heavily defensive, and emergency protocols usually have to take over because the individual is no longer interacting with the present reality.
Okay, so if the brain reacts to vague internal stress by creating a fictional fire, what happens when it encounters a bureaucracy that is genuinely cold, complex, and unyielding?
It's a recipe for disaster.
Right. We have a service user whose internal fire alarm is ringing loudly, whose threat detection is dialed up to maximum. What happens when we take that highly sensitized nervous system and force it to interact with a formal institution?
That collision is exactly where secondary trauma is born. And to understand it, we really have to look at how a traumatized brain maps the concept of an institution.
Clive S.'s experience with the justice system gives us a terrifyingly clear look at this collision. He wrote an essay about a profound institutional failure regarding his own child.
Yes. His child was sexually abused, and despite substantial evidentiary material, the policing and prosecutorial processes failed catastrophically to secure a conviction.
The perpetrator literally walked free. And Clive writes that the dominant emotional outcome for him wasn't fear, it was rage.
A profound powerlessness and a biological protest against injustice.
He experienced homicidal ideation toward the perpetrator, but he actively suppressed it because he had made a promise to his child that she wouldn't lose her father to the prison system.
And the psychological displacement he describes next is so crucial for any professional working in public services to understand.
Because he couldn't direct that immense biological rage at the perpetrator without destroying his own family, the anger needed a new target.
He writes that he no longer experienced police officers as individual human beings with distinct personalities or lives.
He experienced the uniform itself as the institution.
Exactly. The individual officer entirely disappeared behind the symbol of the state. The system, in his mind, became a single, continuous, monolithic actor that was complicit in the harm against his child.
I struggle with this concept a bit. I mean, if an institution is literally just made up of individual humans trying to do their jobs,
Right, some good, some bad.
some just tired, why is it so difficult for the traumatized brain to see the human sitting right in front of them? Why does the individual vanish so completely?
Because for a nervous system in a state of high alert, differentiating between individuals within a predatory system is incredibly cognitively expensive.
It takes too much brain power.
Yes. And more importantly, it feels biologically unsafe. When an institution has harmed you or failed you catastrophically, your amygdala maps that entire institution as a primary threat.
So if you walk into a police station or a hospital and start trying to differentiate, like, well, Officer A was polite, but Officer B ignored me.
And social worker C is brand new, but the policy written by Director D is what ruined my life.
That requires your prefrontal cortex to do massive amounts of nuanced analytical work while your body is literally screaming at you to run.
Furthermore, the system persists even when the staff turn over. Treating the massive opaque system as one single continuous entity is a highly rational, efficient defense mechanism.
It prevents accountability from dissolving into staff turnover, shift changes, and procedural red tape.
Exactly. So the lack of differentiation isn't a cognitive failure on the part of the patient. It's an active safety strategy to ensure the threat isn't lost in the bureaucracy.
That makes so much sense, and this directly aligns with the findings from the Mental Health Foundation and the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust report on trauma.
The WCMT report, yes. There is a growing vital recognition that public institutions, whether statutory mental health services, the criminal justice system, or social care, often inadvertently perpetuate trauma precisely because of how they operate as faceless structures.
They cause secondary harm not necessarily through malice, but through their fundamental design.
The report highlights the work of Dr. Karen Treisman, a clinical psychologist who researches trauma-informed organizational cultures.
She points out that most institutions lack a system-wide culture of care. They rely on piecemeal, performative efforts.
Her famous example is that you can't just put a bowl of fresh fruit in the reception area or mandate a 2-hour afternoon training seminar on empathy for your staff and suddenly declare yourselves a trauma-informed organization.
Right, because the building itself is often traumatizing. The fluorescent lighting, the heavy security doors, the jargon-heavy intake forms.
These all signal threat to a sensitized nervous system.
Dr. Treisman outlines the 4 R's required for a genuinely trauma-informed paradigm transformation.
Right. An organization must realize the widespread impact of trauma on human biology.
They must recognize the behavioral signs and symptoms in both clients and their own staff.
They need to respond by fully integrating this neurobiological knowledge into every single policy and procedure.
And actively resist re-traumatization.
Which means analyzing how the architecture of the waiting room affects heart rates, how the language in a discharge letter affects the recipient's cortisol levels.
And how power is distributed in clinical spaces. But the reason this whole system change is so fiercely resisted is because of the inherent power asymmetry in statutory settings.
Oh, the power dynamic is massively structurally unbalanced.
Right. In a statutory mental health setting, for instance, the institution controls the official risk narratives. They control access to medication, therapy, and resources.
They hold the permanent records. And the service user is the one expected to be completely vulnerable.
They are required to disclose their deepest traumas, comply with opaque treatment plans, and somehow remain perfectly emotionally regulated under intense scrutiny.
Meanwhile, the professional holds the immense authority to define what behavior is reasonable, what counts as cooperative, and what justifies labeling someone as difficult.
It's like walking into a high-stakes negotiation where the other side holds all your money, writes all the rules, dictates the seating arrangement, and gets to judge your tone of voice while you try to ask for help.
That is a perfect analogy.
Which brings us to the crucible of this entire dynamic, the multidisciplinary team meeting.
Yes, the MDT.
This is the exact focal point where the traumatized individual and the powerful institution collide in real time.
Multidisciplinary meetings are typically framed by management as rational, neutral coordination spaces. Just a group of professionals gathering around a table to discuss care plans and logistics.
But as the source texts on systemic language emphasize, these rooms are actually high-effect containment environments.
They are absolute pressure cookers, where institutional power, individual trauma, and linguistic defense mechanisms violently intersect.
We have a case vignette in our sources that perfectly illustrates this linguistic collision. It's about a service user named Frankie.
Yes, the Frankie case study.
So Frankie is sitting in an MDT meeting with a mental health home treatment team. During the meeting, she is attempting to explain her prior involvement with the service, detailing actions that genuinely harmed her.
And as she speaks, she continually uses collective pronouns.
She points across the table and says, You ignored my calls when I was in crisis. You discharged me without a safety plan. Your team didn't listen to me.
Notice how she isn't differentiating between the specific nurse sitting across from her and the wider healthcare trust.
Right. From a linguistic and psychological standpoint, this is what the author terms cognitive compression.
Yes. For Frankie, the multiple clinical actors, the shifting shift patterns, the opaque administrative policy decisions, they are all compressed by her trauma into one continuous, singular system.
The word you becomes shorthand for the service as actor.
It is her only available linguistic tool to hold a massive, decentralized system accountable for its collective failures.
But the professional sitting across the table hearing the word you does not process it as a systemic critique, do they?
They absolutely don't. And understanding why they don't is the key to fixing these meetings.
Okay, so what happens on the other side of the table?
Well, the professional experience is a phenomenon the author defines as institutional countertransference.
Countertransference. That's a classic psychoanalytic term, right?
Yes, typically it's when a therapist unknowingly projects their own unresolved emotional material onto the patient. But in the high-stakes environment of an MDT meeting, the professional experiences something broader and more insidious.
They experience role fusion.
Exactly. Due to the immense pressure of their jobs, their personal moral identity becomes entirely intertwined with their institutional role.
I struggle with this because it seems so instinctual. I mean, if someone is sitting across a table from me, looking me in the eye and accusing me of ruining their life, my deep biological instinct is to defend my personal character.
Of course it is.
How is a clinician expected to just override millions of years of evolutionary self-defense in real time?
That is exactly why it is so difficult and why we have to view it biologically rather than just as a failure of professionalism.
Because it's hardwired into us.
Evolutionary biology wires us to defend our moral standing within our tribe because being perceived as unethical or dangerous historically meant exile and death.
Right. If the tribe kicks you out, you die.
So when Frankie says, "You discharged me and left me to die," the professional doesn't hear a critique of hospital policy.
The professional experiences an acute identity threat. They hear, you, the individual, sitting right here, personally, maliciously, and unethically decided to abandon me. And the professional's own internal fire alarm instantly triggers.
Precisely. The professional is already operating under high cognitive, load-managing, heavy caseloads, navigating the constant risk of formal complaints.
And suffering from the moral distress of working in underfunded public services.
When they perceive a personal moral attack, their amygdala hijacks their prefrontal cortex. They retreat into procedural, adversarial self-defense.
Their empathy shuts down.
Completely. And they start throwing up bureaucratic shields, saying things like, "Well, I wasn't actually on shift that day," or "Our trust policy clearly states that we must follow these guidelines."
It's the highest stakes version of yelling at a customer service rep on the phone.
Yes.
You call up and scream, "You overcharged me, you stole my money." And the rep immediately gets defensive, saying, "I didn't do anything, I just answer the phones. I don't set the corporate pricing."
But to the customer, the voice on the phone is the company. There's no separation.
Except in an MDT meeting, we aren't talking about a $30 billing error. We are talking about psychological survival, access to life-saving care, and profound trauma. The stakes are infinite.
And when the professional gets defensive and hides behind hospital policy, the meeting entirely ceases to be therapeutic.
It stops being a collaborative space for problem solving.
The service user feels completely unheard and dismissed, so their nervous system dictates that they must escalate their language and their volume to try and break through the professional's procedural wall.
And how does the system respond to that?
By tightening its protocols, increasing control, and ultimately permanently labeling the service user as high conflict, borderline, or difficult to engage.
The breakdown is complete.
And everyone leaves the room feeling significantly less safe than when they walked in.
So we have this perfectly predictable, biologically driven collision. We know that trauma forces service users to compress the system into a collective you. And we know that evolutionary biology forces professionals suffering from role fusion to take that word as a personal moral attack and defend themselves.
Yes.
If we know exactly how the train derails, how do we rebuild the tracks? How can clinicians and meeting chairs prepare the room before the service user even opens their mouth?
This brings us to the profound psychological concept of designing the container.
Okay, what exactly is a container in this context?
In psychodynamic terms, a container is a safe, emotional, and structural space that can hold intense anxiety, anger, and distress without fracturing.
According to organizational containment theory, which was pioneered by psychoanalyst Isabel Menzies-Life, in her work with nursing staff in the 1950s, containment must be actively and intentionally designed by leadership.
It cannot be assumed. Institutions naturally generate massive amounts of anxiety, both for the patients and the staff.
And Menzies-Life proved that if you don't build specific social and administrative structures to metabolize that anxiety, it will destroy the therapeutic relationship and lead to staff burnout.
So it is structurally negligent to just put a traumatized patient and a stressed clinician in a room and hope everyone acts professionally.
You have to engineer the psychological safety net. And our sources provide a literal step-by-step protocol for designing this container in modern MDTs.
They do, and it's brilliant.
It begins with what they call the 30-second pre-meeting framing.
Yes. Before the meeting officially begins, or as the first order of business, the chair or facilitator must explicitly name the linguistic dynamic that is about to occur.
They need to state out loud to the room. In this meeting, collective language like you or they, used by the service user, will be treated as referring to the wider service or the systemic timeline unless a specific individual is explicitly named.
They literally announce the rules of translation before the conversation starts.
Why does stating that out loud change the neurobiology of the room?
Because by naming the dynamic before it happens, you entirely remove the element of surprise. And surprise is what triggers the amygdala's threat response.
So you are effectively providing the professionals in the room with a prefrontal cognitive anchor.
You're telling their nervous systems, when the accusation comes, and it will come, it is not about your personal morality. It is a systemic critique.
This creates a psychological safety net for the staff.
And what we know from interpersonal neurobiology and limbic resonance is that a regulated, calm professional emitting low-stress signals creates a profoundly regulating environment for the service user.
The protocol goes a step further and states you must also assign a specific containment role.
Yes, a designated person in the room, usually the chair, whose primary job is not to engage in the clinical debate, but to monitor the exact dynamic we are talking about.
Their sole job is to track linguistic misinterpretations. They aren't there to argue the facts of the case. They are there to watch the emotional temperature of the room.
They name escalation the moment it starts, and they constantly re-anchor the conversation to shared goals.
Think about the meetings you run. Do you have a container designed to handle emotional anxiety, or do you just hope everyone stays polite?
It forces us to look at how we run our own professional spaces. If an organization is dealing with deep institutional trauma and high conflict scenarios, relying on basic politeness or standard meeting agendas is a recipe for secondary harm.
The container must be robust enough to hold the rage without letting it injure the staff.
Exactly.
Let's look at the reality, though. Even with the best pre-meeting framing in the world, human biology is stubborn.
True.
The chair gives the 30-second speech, the meeting starts, but it gets heated. A clinician's identity gets threatened, their heart rate spikes, and they start getting defensive. The container is cracking.
It happens.
What exact actionable steps can be taken in the moment to repair the breach?
We can return to the case of Frankie for this.
Okay.
So the interaction had moved away from collaborative care planning into a defensive procedural exchange. The professional felt personally implicated by Frankie's use of you and was preparing to argue back.
Right.
This is the exact moment where the facilitator holding the containment role must execute a translation question.
The translation question. The technique of depersonalizing the attack without silencing the service user.
Exactly. The goal of the translation question is to clarify the target of the aggressive language without ever telling the service user that their anger is invalid or that they need to calm down.
Because telling a panicked nervous system to calm down is fundamentally activating, right?
Oh, it's the worst thing you can say. It signals that their threat response is being dismissed. Instead, the facilitator steps in smoothly and asks, Frankie, I want to make sure we are hearing you correctly. When you say you, do you mean this specific individual sitting here today, or do you mean the service and your experience over time?
That is such a subtle but powerful pivot. You aren't suppressing the emotion. You are asking for linguistic clarity, which gently forces the service user's cognitive brain, their prefrontal cortex, to engage to answer the question.
Which momentarily pauses the limbic emotional surge.
And if the professional has already taken the bait and become outwardly defensive,
the facilitator immediately deploys a scripted repair move. They say clearly to the room, I'm noticing the tension rising here. Let's slow down. We can hold systemic accountability and address these failures without making this a personal moral trial for the staff present.
I can hear clinicians pushing back on the idea of using pre-planned scripts. Like if I'm sitting there feeling genuinely attacked and the chair reads a canned line from a manual, doesn't it feel robotic? Does it dismiss my genuine, valid feeling of being unfairly targeted?
It's a completely valid concern, but the clinical reality is actually the exact opposite.
How so?
Using a structured, recognizable repair move is what protects the professional's empathy from collapsing. When a professional is drowning in feelings of being unfairly attacked, their capacity for empathy neurobiologically shuts down to divert energy to self-defense.
They put up thick emotional armor.
Right. By using a script to clearly remind the entire room that the attack isn't personal, the professional is immediately freed from the heavy psychological burden of defending their own morality.
Oh, I see. They don't have to fight back to prove they are a good person.
Exactly. This relief allows them to drop the defensive armor and remain genuinely empathetically present with the service user's pain.
The script basically acts as a circuit breaker for the clinician's own amygdala.
Yes. The source material refers to this broader strategy as focusing on process over content. In the heat of a pattern surge, you never debate the reality of the service user's narrative.
So if Frankie says, you people maliciously tried to ruin my life last year, you don't say, no, we didn't. Let's open the files and check the dates.
No, debating the historical reality just feeds the cognitive loop. It proves to the service user that you are adversarial. Instead, you focus entirely on state regulation.
The precise clinical term for this, as detailed in the texts, is the dual-lane reset.
Yes. When someone is in a highly activated sympathetic state, a professional has to manage two lanes simultaneously. They must discharge the cognitive activation, and they must actively downshift the individual's physiology.
You validate the intensity of the fear without necessarily validating the factual accuracy of the threat narrative.
You match their emotional intensity, but lower your vocal register, slow your breathing, and say, I can see how terrifying and infuriating that experience was for you.
Rather than arguing about the logistical details of who made which phone call, you use your own regulated nervous system to pull theirs back from the brink via the vagus nerve.
Exactly.
Okay, let's say the facilitator executes this perfectly. The translation question clarifies the language. The dual-lane reset brings the physiological temperature of the room down, the tension is de-escalated, and the meeting concludes constructively.
A successful meeting.
But in the ecosystem of public services, the meeting isn't actually over until the paperwork is filed. If it isn't written down in the system, it legally didn't happen.
This is a huge point.
How that specific meeting is documented in the administrative pipeline can either be a tool for long-term healing or a literal permanent weapon for secondary harm.
Documentation holds massive, long-lasting power, often outliving the clinicians who write it. Medical and social care records are highly susceptible to confirmation bias and heuristic thinking by subsequent providers.
We discussed earlier how service users often get permanently labeled as high conflict or non-compliant.
And that label almost always originates in the meeting minutes. When a stressed clinician writes down, the patient was hostile, highly uncooperative, and made aggressive, accusatory statements towards staff, That single sentence goes into the permanent electronic file.
It fundamentally alters the clinical perception of the next professional and the professional after that, before they have even met the patient.
Yes. The new nurse on the next shift reads hostile patient. Their own threat detection system spikes, and they walk into the room with their guard already up,
Their tone is already clipped.
which immediately triggers the patient's fire alarm all over again. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy orchestrated entirely by the administrative record.
Wow. So the label of difficult relocates the system's failure entirely onto the service user's shoulders.
It is the ultimate act of institutional self-protection. It completely erases the context of the systemic trauma and focuses exclusively on the patient's biological reaction to that trauma.
This is why the ethics of lived experience capture, how we write down what people tell us about their pain, are so incredibly vital.
Yes.
The pen is literally the most powerful and dangerous tool in the room. Whoever writes the minutes writes the permanent history of that individual's care. So how does a clinician document a highly charged meeting safely and accurately without lying about the tension, but without condemning the patient?
The source material provides a specific ethical phrasing requirement for taking minutes during these complex interactions.
Okay, what's the phrasing?
If a service user is venting profound systemic frustration and using collective pronouns, the documentation should objectively reflect the systemic nature of the grievance. The minutes should explicitly read, collective pronouns used by the service user during this meeting recur to their system-level experience and are not recorded as personal allegations against present staff unless explicitly stated.
That one sentence is an absolute masterclass in trauma-informed administration.
Is it?
It acknowledges the service user's deep dissatisfaction and anger with their care, ensuring their voice is on the record. But simultaneously, it legally and procedurally protects the individual staff members from having formal allegations of abuse logged against them.
And it protects the patient from being permanently branded as a hostile threat to staff. It completely neutralizes the administrative bomb.
It is the perfect embodiment of holding complexity. It documents the reality of the emotional distress without using the bureaucratic system to punish anyone for experiencing it.
It's just a smart protocol.
We've spent a lot of time dissecting the intricate mechanics of the MDT meeting itself. We've looked at how to structure the physical and linguistic container, how to execute repair moves, and how to handle the administrative aftermath safely.
But the meeting is ultimately just a means to an end.
Right. The goal of mental health services isn't just to have polite, well-documented meetings. The ultimate goal is helping profoundly traumatized individuals find their way back to a meaningful, integrated life.
Which brings us to the long game, the phase beyond the meeting room, post-traumatic growth and reconnection.
If an MDT meeting is successfully contained, it stops being a roadblock of secondary trauma and actually becomes a launch pad for recovery.
To understand this recovery, we have to look at the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Report on trauma, specifically focusing on veterans.
Though the findings apply universally to severe adversity, right?
Absolutely. The report highlights a crucial paradigm-shifting difference in how we view long-term trauma. Traditionally, the medical model has focused almost exclusively on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is fundamentally a fear-based biological response.
But there is a growing movement to understand deep trauma as moral injury.
Yes. The report defines moral injury not as a mental illness, but as a soul wound.
A soul wound. That's powerful. It's a profound loss of identity steeped in deeply rooted shame and guilt, rather than just fear.
It happens when an individual is involved in, fails to prevent, or witnesses acts that completely transgress their own deeply held moral beliefs.
And the neurobiology of shame is vastly different from the neurobiology of fear. It's an existential crisis that shatters their understanding of goodness in the world and their own place within it.
And this is why traditional clinical therapies, like standard cognitive behavioral therapy or pharmacological interventions, often fall incredibly short when treating a soul wound.
You cannot medicate away a shattered moral compass.
No, and talking therapies often keep the individual trapped in their cognitive loops without addressing the bodily somatic memory. The trauma lives deeply within the physiology and the spirit.
This is where the psychological framework of post-traumatic growth, or PTG, becomes essential.
Developed by researchers Tedeschi and Calhoun, PTG demands we move entirely away from the pathology-driven model that views traumatized people as permanently broken victims who simply need to be managed.
The PTG framework proposes something radical, that through enduring and processing immense trauma, people can actually experience profound, positive psychological transformation.
They discover an internal resilience they never knew existed. They develop a richer appreciation for life, a newly defined sense of purpose, and an incredibly deep, resonant compassion for the suffering of others.
The goal isn't to just return them to their pre-trauma baseline. The goal is to help them integrate the trauma so they can grow beyond that baseline into leadership and profound connection.
But the crucial caveat of post-traumatic growth is that it cannot be achieved in isolation. The nervous system requires communal regulation to heal from moral injury.
The WCMT report highlights several holistic, community-based approaches that actively facilitate this growth by targeting the mind and body simultaneously.
For example, the Lone Survivor Foundation in the United States runs intensive, 5-day therapeutic retreats for veterans dealing with severe moral injury, traumatic brain injuries, and chronic pain.
And the brilliance of their approach is that it isn't just sitting in a clinical circle talking about the worst day of your life. They use somatic, body-up interventions.
They use neurofeedback, therapy pools, and most notably, equine-assisted learning.
They use horses. Why horses?
Because horses are prey animals with incredibly sensitive nervous systems. They act as massive biofeedback mirrors.
Oh, wow.
If a veteran walks up to a horse with their internal fire alarm ringing, radiating cortisol and sympathetic activation, the horse will physically recoil and refuse to connect.
The veteran actually has to learn to consciously regulate their own vagus nerve, to lower their heart rate and project physical calm in order to get the horse to approach.
It forces the traumatized nervous system to practice physiological regulation in real time, without a single word being spoken.
That's amazing. And the clinical data supporting these holistic somatic approaches is staggering. After a single 3-day intensive retreat combining these modalities, 77% of participants reported a clinically meaningful, sustained reduction in trauma symptoms.
They are achieving this because they are addressing the autonomic nervous system directly, in an environment of absolute physical and psychological safety.
But regulating the body is only the first half of the equation. The second, arguably more difficult half of healing, is bridging the immense gap between the traumatized individual and their wider community.
Because severe trauma is fundamentally disempowering and inherently isolating. It severs your belief that you belong to the human race.
This brings us to what I found to be the most incredibly moving case study in the entire stack of research. The Telling Project in Milwaukee.
Yes. It is a community storytelling and theater initiative.
They take veterans and their family members, interview them for hours about their darkest, most complex experiences of moral injury, and they weave those raw transcripts into a cohesive, poetic, theatrical script.
And then the profound part. The veterans themselves stand on a stage and perform this play directly to an audience of their local civilian community.
The psychological mechanism at work here is communal witnessing. It directly challenges the isolating assumption that only other veterans or only other trauma survivors can possibly understand their pain.
By performing their truth on stage, they are not just recounting facts. They are processing the narrative through their hippocampus while being visibly held in positive regard by their community.
They are actively inviting the civilian audience to bear witness and to share the heavy societal weight of the moral injury.
And after the performance, the structure dictates a dialogue. The barrier is broken. It creates a genuinely safe space for profound societal reconnection.
We started this hour talking about people existing in terrifying, isolated realities, the cognitive acceleration of the pattern surge.
The terrifying derealization of feeling trapped on a balcony in Hong Kong, entirely disconnected from the physical world.
But true healing, like what happens neurologically and socially in the Telling Project, is about the courage to bring those isolated, terrifying internal realities back out into the shared reality of the community.
It's about a survivor standing up and saying, I went to this incredibly dark place, and now I am going to tell you exactly what it looked like, so I no longer have to carry the memory of it alone.
Which is exactly why the dynamic inside the multidisciplinary meeting room is so universally important.
Right. If the MDT meeting is hostile, defensive, and procedurally cold, it reinforces the deep trauma. It biologically signals to the traumatized person, your reality is dangerous and you are not welcome in our community.
But if the meeting is thoughtfully contained, if the professionals can override their own defensive fire alarms and remain empathetic, the room becomes safe.
The meeting itself becomes the very first critical step in that long journey of communal reconnection.
Let's recap the intense mechanical journey we've been on today. We started by looking under the hood of human panic, recognizing the internal fire alarm and the accumulated allostatic load that sets a nervous system on edge.
We broke down the mechanics of the pattern surge, understanding exactly why a brain under threat creates incredibly complex, hostile narratives to explain its own physiological terror.
leading to both fast and slow self-harm as desperate biological attempts at systemic regulation.
We then analyze the exact point of collision, how that highly sensitized nervous system interacts with the severe power asymmetry of a formal institution.
We unpacked the linguistics of cognitive compression, why trauma-affected service users map the entire system onto a single you.
And why professionals, suffering from the evolutionary drive of role fusion, inevitably take that systemic critique as a deeply personal moral attack.
We armed ourselves with highly actionable, neurobiologically grounded tools to fix those rooms. The 30-second pre-meeting framing to design a prefrontal cognitive anchor.
The assignment of a containment role to monitor the room's autonomic state.
The use of translation questions to depersonalize attacks without silencing the patient.
And the repair moves to initiate a physiological dual-lane reset.
And we established exactly how to write the minutes safely, ensuring the administrative documentation protects the patient rather than punishing them with permanent heuristic labels like difficult.
Finally, we looked beyond the clinical file to post-traumatic growth, recognizing that healing a moral injury requires treating the body and demanding reconnection with the community.
As we conclude, I want to leave you with a profound final reflection drawn directly from the writings of Clive S. In analyzing his own journey through systemic trauma, he writes, "You were never taught how to operate yourself, and that is not an accident."
Society deliberately obscures the mechanics of our own biology. We send thousands of well-intentioned professionals out into statutory services to manage the most complex, profoundly traumatized populations on Earth. But we rarely, if ever, teach them how their own nervous systems function under threat.
It is genuinely staggering when you stop to consider it. We train them on the law, we train them on the software, but we leave them completely blind to their own biology.
If trauma-informed care is truly going to be about sweeping systemic transformation, rather than just a bowl of fruit in a reception area, we have to ask a radical question. What if every single professional, regardless of their specific field, social work, policing, healthcare, corporate management, was structurally required to deeply learn their own internal operating system?
What if they had to intimately understand their own flat responses, their own biases, and their own internal fire alarms before they were ever granted the authority to manage the lives and safety of vulnerable others?
How fundamentally would that change the architecture of our justice and healthcare institutions?
That is the question you need to take with you. I encourage you to look at your own operating system and to take these actionable tools, the upfront framing, the linguistic translation questions, the mindful ethical documentation, into your very next meeting.
Change the language you use, and you will fundamentally change the biology of the room.
And remember, usually when we talk about a diagnosis or a systemic failure, we expect clinical precision. We expect it to look like an X-ray showing a clean, easily fixable, broken line.
But you are stepping into a world where the X-ray machine itself is broken.
You are sitting in that small, artificially lit room across the table from a human being whose internal fire alarm is deafening them. You have the immense power to either throw fuel on that biological fire by defending your own ego, or to be the calm, structured container that finally, after years of systemic failure, makes them feel safe enough to heal. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.